Quick quiz. Do you know what the difference is among these perennials and what makes them similar? In this video, I'm going to go over the differences and similarities of perennial natives, near natives, and nativars, and how you can use them in your garden. Hi, I'm Anne. I'm an artist, educator, and lifelong gardener, and I've had to learn how to be creative on a budget. So welcome to my channel if you haven't been here before. I like to help home gardeners find ways to be creative and resourceful with what they already have. At the beginning of this video, I showed 3 images of echinacea. One is a native echinacea, one is a near native, and one is a nativar. So what is the difference between the 3 and what kind of impact are they going to have in my garden? So you may have noticed in the last few decades that native perennials and other plants have really been coming back to gardens and garden designers here and abroad, and there's some really good reasons for that. Generally, native perennials are really hardy and they're well adapted to your local soil and weather conditions. They also usually come back year after year for many years, and they also really support habitats for wildlife and native pollinators. You may be asking, if native perennials are so great, why doesn't everybody just plant natives in their garden? Well, as you may know, near natives and nativars and other cultivars are fun plants. A lot of them are very attractive, have certain kinds of habits that may fit into smaller gardens or planters. It's also kind of a tradition thing. I think sometimes people have an idea that native perennials may not be as attractive, they're not as showy, maybe they have some other kind of characteristics, like they get really tall and lanky, and some people don't like that. It doesn't necessarily fit into kind of a traditional garden plan or layout. Well, I think natives always have a place in your garden, but I do think that near natives and nativars can also be woven into your garden scheme. So what would be a near native? Well, if we're using the echinacea as an example, Echinacea purpurea, or the purple coneflower, would technically be a near native for me. I grow it easily in my yard, and that's because it didn't grow too far from my local climate and soil conditions. So one year we had to move and I couldn't bear to leave some of my plants behind, and that included some of my Magnus echinacea plants. But I think the time of year was awkward, and so the best I could do was actually save seeds for them. So I saved the seeds and I sowed them, direct sowed them at my new garden in the new place we were in, and they grew. So Magnus is a cultivar or nativar. The plants that grew from the seeds did not necessarily come true from the original Magnus plants. They had some of the characteristics of the color and the size of the flowers, but I did get variations in terms of smaller flower size, slightly different pink colors, and some of them even, I think, it looked very similar to the original Echinacea purpurea plants. But in some ways I didn't really mind that because I liked the variety, and the plants that grew from those seeds were still, in my mind, very attractive plants. So I would be really curious to know what your experience has been growing native perennials or near natives or even nativars in your garden, so make sure you comment below. So now let's talk about the last category. What are nativars? So I think about a couple years ago was the first time that I actually heard this term. I always knew what cultivars were, but I had never really heard the term nativar. And so nativars are essentially native plants that have had their genetics selected for certain characteristics, like a certain kind of flower color, a certain height, maybe some kind of disease resistance. So there's really no difference between nativars and cultivars. It's just that nativars have those native perennials as their plant parent. So remember when I talked about how native perennials are great for wildlife and for attracting pollinators to your garden? Well, that's one thing to think about with nativars and near natives. Sometimes these plants are not the best at doing that job like the native perennials. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Near natives are, like I said before, really close to the native perennials in your area that you're growing, but not exactly specific. A good example of a problem with a nativar could be like our double echinacea flower. With double flowered plants, oftentimes it becomes confusing for wildlife or insects to know that this is a plant that they should like. Having those double and multiple kinds of petals can actually inhibit the insect from accessing the pollen or the nectar from the flower. That's why a lot of native perennials you'll see open rayed flowers with a visible center or cone. And it's really obvious for those insects that this is their landing pad and this is where they can find all of the goodies that they're looking for in your garden. Also, another thing a lot of people don't think about is all of the wonderful colors that we can get with nativars. Sometimes these are not natural to the native plants, and therefore the insects or wildlife don't recognize them as the plants that they should be going to. And so even though we love the colors and we love the flower forms, it's not necessarily something that the native populations of bees are looking for. But I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't use near natives or nativars in your garden, that you should only use native perennials. If you watched any of my other videos, you probably know that I have a lot of different kinds of plants in my garden, and I really think it's fun to buy those near natives or nativars to play with in your garden design. But I'm really trying to set a foundation to attract beneficial insects into my yard, so I really need to give them big groupings and swaths of those native perennials that they like. Well, I hope this video helped you, and if you're interested in more gardening tips or if you need more help with planting your garden, I've got a whole playlist here and a link in my description here.